Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Christian Reeve podcast. Today's guest is an author, podcaster, and storyteller hailing all the way from South Carolina. But before we get into that, a quick reminder to go and follow the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you listen to the podcast. Make sure you leave us a review if you like this episode and other episodes that we've done. It really, really helps the show. There'll be a link to Podchaser in the review section down below the description. And make sure to subscribe to us on YouTube. All of that support really, really helps out the show. Make sure to join the Discord and also join our Patreon. Okay, I think I'm done with the plug now. Back to our guest, author, podcaster, and storyteller hailing all the way from South Carolina, Jonathan Phoinex. Welcome to the show. How you doing, buddy?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. Yeah, that quick promo thing, like I keep forgetting to do that, and I'm trying to get into like the how you say like what's the word I'm looking for? My brain's just going right now. The rhythm of doing it, or like doing it at the beginning and the end, and like we all have like these processes that we need to adhere to, and like try different things and whatnot. And I don't know. I always kind of forget with that. Like I have my process, but then sometimes I kind of like forget with these things. What's your
Yeah.
process?
So when I'm doing the podcast, I try to throw it in at the end.
Yeah,
As I'm wrapping up, I'm like, hey, remember, head over to thecarolinastoryteller.com, check out the podcast, check out the links, check out the merch, check out the books, get the information on my guests. But sometimes, yeah, I'm like, oh, my podcast, we've run really long this time. This went a little bit over. Thanks for listening. Stay spooky, my friends. And that's the end of the podcast. It's just, and I'm like, I didn't ask for any plugs. I didn't ask for reviews. I didn't remind anybody about the website. How are they going to know? Because it really does help us out as podcasters. Just when you leave that review, um, letting us know what you think, or if you share it, or if you subscribe, it really does help us out. It allows us to, you know, get enough to put back into the podcast because it's not exactly cheap to do this.
I know. I'll tell you now, I've not earned a single penny from this. I love doing it. I would love to earn money from it, but yeah, you're not kidding, man. It's a lot of hard work, a lot of investment, and who knows if it'll go somewhere, right? But one quick question I have to ask you before we sort of delve into your show and everything else. Um, how long ago did you start sort of plugging? Like, did you plug from the very beginning, or did you sort of do it later on? And then, yeah, let's start there.
I think I plugged a little bit from the beginning because I was an author first.
Hmm.
I started out when I started out writing. I was on TikTok, and I've released two books, and then I started the podcast. So it was kind of hey, if you want to know more, you can go check out my books
Sure.
and this. And so I was plugging my books from the beginning. Um, when you're an author, you plug your books every chance you get. Hey, go read my books, Through the Flames and Redcoats. Every chance you get, you should read Redcoats. It's a great book, um, especially if you're British and you want to, get revenge on us Yanks for the Revolutionary War. It's a great book.
I asked because,
Um,
like, I guess I've only just started doing this specific type of plugin. Like, I've always kind of plugged here and there, but I used to just like to have the attitude of let the content speak for itself. But then I changed my mind a couple of years ago, mostly based on feedback from my wonderful viewers. Love you guys. Thank you so much, and listeners. And I don't know, like, it works a little bit for me, but it's not like completely changed everything. I guess I
it,
just wanted to kind of speak to you a little bit on that for a minute. Like,
it's got to be natural,
hmm,
and there's nothing wrong with giving your audience a call to action.
sure.
They're going to listen, but letting them know how important it is to you and how much it does mean to you does give them that call to action to go and say, hey, you know what, we're gonna help out Christian and make sure that we support him so that he keeps making episodes. And when you're doing this, one of the problems I found is that I don't get a lot of interaction from my audience. I have a couple of friends that do listen to the podcast, And the most interaction I'll get is them coming up to me like, "Wow, that was a really good episode. That was really good. I really liked that story, or I loved this story, or I wasn't into that story." Um, but that's the feedback that I get, and it's like I would really love some more feedback. We podcasters, we need the feedback because it tells us what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. It's really a learning thing, even for people that have been doing this for 4, 5, 10 years. It's always an evolving craft, I've found. I'm finishing up my first season with my podcast. I have I just released an episode today. I've got 2 bonus episodes and 2 full episodes, and then my finale on Halloween night. And I'm done until January.
Oh wow.
And I'm taking 2 months off to make sure I work on next season and get some good content going. Um, but like I've learned a lot. Like I've learned that sometimes the interviews are sometimes instead of me just telling a story, me having someone in to talk about the story I'm telling does better. And sometimes the story sells for itself. Sometimes they need that little back and forth. Sometimes they don't. And it's a give and take. And I'm still learning as I go along. So I think it's always a learning process for us. And as artists and content creators, we're always growing and becoming something new.
That's nicely put. Yeah, I totally
Yeah.
agree. I think the interesting part about this as well, like to speak to what you just said, is that your audience is divided. So like there's people in my audience who are very vocal and will say, what they like, what they dislike, etc. And it's brilliant. It's really helpful. I do also think though there is always going to be a subsection of your audience who are just quiet. They really like the content. Obviously, they keep listening, they keep watching, but they don't necessarily comment, and that doesn't necessarily reflect in a negative way. It's just that you're just listening. It's the same way that if you're maybe your favorite live streamers, for example, maybe you just kind of want to sit, listen to it, have it on in the background, whatever, but you don't always necessarily want to engage. I know of myself when I listen to live streams, I don't tend to engage, mostly because like there's about 1,000 comments, so you'll never get seen. But it's that kind of thing of like, people interact with content differently, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And then let's not forget that, like you said, they might be thinking, oh, there's 1,000 contents. I'm never going to hear from this person. Um, when I started doing interviews, because, I started off, I was just going to tell stories. And I had someone say, hey, you should, do podcasts with other people and, get some of their stories and some of their feedback. So I reached out to an author and a friend of mine, the demon folklorist Victoria J. Her book comes out next month. She's a really good friend of mine. And I was like, hey, do you want to do my podcast with me? You have a podcast. I have a podcast. I would love to have you come on my show, especially because you're the demon expert. And I've told some ghost stories that could be demons. And we want to hash that out. And she was like, yeah, sure. And she was supposed to be my first guest. And it kept getting pushed back and kept getting pushed back. And I ended up having another guest on. He was a paranormal podcaster out of Tennessee. And just so happened, I got him on the show after telling a story of Julia Brown, who was a voodoo priestess in the early 1900s in near New Orleans. And she predicted that a town was going to be destroyed on the day she died, or
Oh,
as she was on at her death. She died, and on the day of her funeral, a hurricane came up and literally swept 3 towns in New Orleans off the map. And of
oh
course,
my.
everybody said, "Oh, she cursed the town," but looking at who she was as a person, she was warning the town more than likely. She knew something was coming somehow, some way. She knew. And, we had a really good conversation. My entire episode was about her cursing the town, but after talking to somebody who knew the background and had the information, because he grew up in that swamp where, the legend came from, and he's like, yeah, it was probably more along the lines, so getting the guests in really changes things because you learn so much, and I really love doing it now.
I have to just ask you on that specific story. Were there any major clues in sort of her particular life story that would lead one to believe that that would be the kind of the final outcome
So
for everybody?
what's interesting is that the with ghost stories, and this is one of the things that I love doing about my podcast, because you learn more when you start digging into it. So
Hmm.
with Julia Brown in particular, um, the legend is that as she was getting older and dying, she was mad at the town because they took her for granted, and so she would sing songs, and she began to sing a song about how the town was going to get wiped away when she died. The town was going to go with her when she died, and she sung prophetic songs. Well, the thing is that Miss Brown, based off of her history, she was a wet nurse. She helped birth kids. She helped take care of people. She did practice voodoo, but the stigma around voodoo is that it's bad. But voodoo is actually a religion of peace, harmony, and help. And voodoo actually integrates in with Catholicism.
Interesting.
It's something that's kind of been mixed in. There are a lot of voodoo practitioners that are devoutly Catholic because it's not supposed to be a bad thing. We only paint it as a bad thing in the movies because it makes a good scapegoat. Um, and so, being that she was this, very giving and caring soul, it doesn't make sense for the sudden switch at the end. So, the evidence based on her past and how she treated her family, how she treated the town, is that when Auntie Julia was sitting there singing the songs, she was trying to warn the people, and they didn't listen. And remember, if she was such a bad person, there were 26 people at her funeral
Hmm.
when the storm hit. They went to They went to run and hide in a train depot, and the train depot was destroyed. Um, you know, these people were there, celebrating the end of her life, not celebrating that she was gone, but celebrating her life. You don't get a group of people coming to celebrate your life if you're a horrible person. So she was paid. She was paid respect. She was treated with respect, um, and for some reason, she knew that a storm was coming. Um, you can take that any way that you want. She made a guess. She was right, and nobody listened to her. Hurricane came and took the towns away. And it's very interesting because the level of destruction from the hurricane is similar to the level from Hurricane Katrina. So when you start looking at it, you go, wait a minute. They knew that something like this could happen because they had it happen almost 100 years before, and they didn't do anything about it. So when you look at Katrina, you're like, oh, this wasn't a surprise to them. This wasn't new. They knew something like this could happen.
As in, like, just
A
predicting
hurricane
weather
coming through,
pa-
and
yeah, like,
well,
so they
no,
would have
the
had
destruction that a hurricane could cause.
sure, okay, yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
everybody and a lot of people in the government surrounding New Orleans tried to say that they couldn't have ever expected something like this to happen. But then when you learn the history, something like that happened not even 100 years ago. Well, 100 years before. It was 1915, I think, is when the hurricane wiped out the towns in the Manchoc Swamp. And then 2004, Hurricane Katrina hits New Orleans 30 miles away. The same level of destruction, basically, only it was the same type of destruction, basically, only on a grander scale because you had a higher population base and no preparation. It was once again, why didn't you pay attention and listen?
No, no. I mean, it's a good point, especially if a particular location is ill prepared.
Yes.
It just affects you in a different way. I mean, this is not even remotely the same thing, but when there's snow on a pretty big scale in London, they're always really, really ill prepared for it, especially like travel, like trains, stuff like that. It's pretty much all just out of service at that point. Whereas the rest of the country is very used to having snow, like say in the north. It happens every year. Now we're starting to see that change, certainly over the last, I'd say 10, maybe 15 years, it's changed considerably. But like when I was a kid, like snow in London was just very, like you get like a laughable amount, you know, like nothing. But it's amazing how it puts everything to a standstill, and there's just basic things that people that you don't have that you would have elsewhere, like things like just having making sure you have the salt that you need to like melt the snow and stuff like that, and just like clearing the roads and so on.
I live in the South of America.
Mhm.
If it snows down here, even the slightest bit, we think that it's the end of the world. Like if we
Damn.
start seeing snow, nobody knows what to do when there's snow around here. Um, this far south, snow is like apocalyptic to us. We
Jeez.
the kids love it, but anybody over the age of 18 is just like, oh no, it's snow. People don't know how to drive. Everything shuts down. It's just, it's a mess when it snows down here.
I suppose it's scarier like the further away you are from, I suppose, like inner city stuff like that. You know, especially if you're in
Yeah,
like a rural location. I mean,
yeah.
you're screwed, really. I mean, like access to resources and stuff, and yeah,
Hope you went to the grocery store yesterday.
right, yeah, like stuff like that becomes a very real problem in those instances for people, and it's yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting though.
Yes, it is.
Let's go back to talking about your podcast. I want to just kind of shine a light on this. So it's called "Let Me Tell You a Story," which is brilliant.
Yes.
I love the name. Talk to us a little bit about like how this came to be, like the idea behind it, and like I know you've sort of explained a little bit about the structure, but just kind of expand upon that a little bit for us.
So, I've always been a bit of a storyteller. I used to love hearing ghost stories and legends and things like that when I was younger. I grew up in Georgetown, South Carolina. If you're not aware, it's 60 miles north of Charleston. It's all just swarming with history and legend. Revolutionary War and everything took place there. Civil War and everything took place there. So you grow up and you hear all these stories, and the way of telling stories by word of mouth is an art. It's an art form. And so I would listen to these stories and I'd want to be able to tell the stories. So when I got older and I had kids and I had nieces and I had nephews, every Halloween would come around and I would sit around and I would tell the stories to the kids. I had this, at one point, I had this Metallica skull that I called Frank. And it was supposed to be an ashtray, but it was Metallica. And I put a little candle in his mouth and light the candle, and I'd sit Frank down, and I'd tell the ghost stories to the kids every year at Halloween, and until the youngest was 12, I think. Just keep telling the stories. And then eventually, it would come up, and I'd tell the stories to friends, and I'd tell stories about my time as a firefighter. And I was on TikTok. I had just finished my second book, or no, I had published my second book. I was working on my third, and I was telling a story um, about Lavinia Fisher, who she's a serial killer from Charleston. I can get into that later. But one of my coworkers looks at me and goes, "I love listening to you tell stories. You should do that." And it was just like, okay, I'll do that. So I recorded 4 episodes, and it was Lavinia Fisher. I told a story about fighting a fire. I told a story about a time I dealt with a ghost, and I told another story. Can't remember what the fourth one was, but those were the first 4 episodes, and I kind of had those all lined up, ready to go, and then I started the podcast with those lined up to come out every week, and then started just recording different stories, and based off of the Lavinia Fisher was a huge hit. The firefighting story didn't take didn't really go very far. And so it's kind of been just, okay, I'm going to go with this story. That story didn't do that good. Okay, let's try it back this way. And it's kind of course correcting all the way through. But that's really where it came from, was somebody looked at me and said, I love hearing you tell stories. Do it again. And if Nikki happens to see this, thank you, Nikki. Nikki's also my one of my only Patreon supporters. So thank you, because that was your idea. This is all your fault.
I gotta say that there's something to be said for how captivating it can be when you find someone who knows how to tell a good story. And you mentioned there earlier about how it takes a certain kind of skill set to be able to tell these stories to people. So I guess my next question to you is, in your opinion, what does it mean to be a good storyteller?
You have to get animated in the story. You don't necessarily have to do the voices, but it is a lot about delivery. Um, Sometimes you got to take that Shatner-esque, cadence. If you know William Shatner's cadence, the
Oh God,
you
no,
can't
that
stop this from happening.
that would drive me
And granted,
nuts.
Shatner's cadence is because of his medical issues, but
Oh wow.
that cadence, the dramatic pauses, the knowing when to stop, knowing how to enunciate, it takes a lot of getting animated in the story, knowing how to deliver it. And some of that you can't learn, it's just natural. And others you have to practice over time. Um, Watching how others do it, seeing how they deliver their stories. I do listen to a lot of podcasts now, which I didn't before, because I want to hear what everybody else is doing so I can improve what I'm doing. I like to listen in and go, okay, all right. I like how this was delivered. I didn't like how that was delivered. I like what they did there. You know, some people they do the voices and they can change their voice and they can go up here, or they can go down here. I'm not really good at that.
I'd say you're pretty
Um,
good. Sounds pretty
uh,
good.
my son is really good at that. I'm
Yeah.
mediocre, but they do all the different voices, and I don't do the different voices. I had to find my own take on it, and I had to make it my own. And you know, when I'm doing a story, I do the research. So I'll give you the story or legend as it's told, and then I'll give you the facts, because I find that's the more entertaining part. Now, granted, if I was trying to scare somebody, I'd just tell them the story. Leave the facts out. Who needs the facts? Story's better.
I gotta say though, like there is something to be said for like the way a story's been told. And obviously you covered some of that with
Mm-hmm.
your example there with the cadence and the pauses, the dramatic, for instance, I always bring this up, but I'm a huge professional wrestling fan. And I've got to say that some of my favorite wrestlers or wrestling personalities have often been amazing storytellers. And it's something about a combination of their intensity, maybe their conviction, their passion, all these different things. And they all do it in different ways. So, a few examples for the listeners at home. CM Punk, Jim Cornette are some good examples of good storytellers who they do it in very different ways.
Mm-hmm.
CM Punk, as an example, is very passionate and he can kind of win you over and pull you in. And he often uses the example of like he's gonna bring in the house, which is like a wrestling term for like this is how I bring them in the building, bring them in, lure them in into
Mm-hmm.
caring essentially. Whereas Jim Cornette was always very heated and passionate, and he often played a bad guy and would kind of shout you down and stuff like that. Another good example is Jake the Snake Roberts, who, to our
Oh
point,
yeah.
right, about the whole, he, instead of every other wrestler in his time, was like, I'm going to kick your ass at the best pay per view, like all that. But Jake would just be really quiet and just be like, here's what I'm going to do to you at the next pay per view. I'm going to lure you in, brother. And then we're going to go one on one. And you're going to know that I'm serious. Because when I lure you in, it'll be the end of you. And it's just like really intense, and you feel like a sinister kind of undertone in there. You're like, oh, and it's like that, whatever that element is, being able to maybe like convince people that you mean what you say, or being passionate in some way, or do you know what I mean? Because like I often find sometimes when you're telling a story, the story doesn't even necessarily have to be that good, but the way you tell it is everything.
Well, remember, nothing sells a story better than a good villain.
Sure.
And and particularly in wrestling, a lot of people give wrestling a lot of crap, but there is a lot of artistry that is done,
Oh my God,
not
yes.
just in their movements in the ring, but in how they talk and how they deal with each other. If you ever see these guys outside, you would not believe that they were the people that were just on stage trash talking each other. And not only that, but the ones that can change their characters. A good example is Paul the Voice, Hunter Hearst Helmsley,
Mm-hmm.
Shawn Michaels, the two of them going from being single wrestlers to the goofy DX to the just downright degenerate DX. Um, then, Shawn Michaels going to the professional commissioner with DX backing him. The changes that these characters were able to make in evolving. Another good example would be The Undertaker's character, which and not only continuously evolved throughout his career, but he was able to give you there was a real story with that
Mm.
character, even when he went from being the dead man to the American badass riding around on the motorcycle. There was no more hat and gloves. He was just this big dude on a motorcycle that just beat people up. Even when he went to that level, um, he was still to giving you a story. Um, Dwayne Johnson, The Rock Johnson, a great at delivery. Macho Man Randy Savage,
Oh,
you know,
3 minute
um,
crap.
oh yeah, the Macho Man is here today to tell you something, brother. He was able to just he delivered in such a way that, for one, you always knew it was him. You didn't have to be in the room. You heard that voice and you knew it was Macho Man. It didn't matter if he was in a cartoon. Didn't matter if he was in a movie fighting Spider-Man. Didn't matter where he was. You knew Macho Man. You knew if somebody even said the words, "Oh yeah," you immediately went Macho Man. You knew what they were talking about. He was iconic in that delivery. Another good example is Sting.
Mm.
Sting did it without saying a word. Sting put on Sting put on the Crow makeup and then the Crow outfit, and literally just did his entire storytelling for years with just his mannerisms, his look, his body. There's a lot that goes into professional wrestling when it comes to telling a story. And, you know, a lot of that you bring into when you're telling a story to someone. Those are the things that make a good storyteller is, you know, these professional wrestlers are great examples of it. You point out actors all the time. Oh, this actor's great. That actor's great. Yeah, put that actor up in front of a whole bunch of people and let them go. Go see somebody on Broadway. They're great.
I think something that's really like, yeah, I totally agree with all of that. I've spoken on the show about storytelling with wrestling. I'll defend wrestling to the end. I don't care. Wrestling is amazing. It's brilliant. Wrestlers don't get nearly enough credit for the amount of hard work they put into commitment to character, acting, method acting, their storytelling, everything. Like there's so much in wrestling from a psychological perspective to dissect, and it really is incredible what some of these people pull off, and I'll never stop being amazed. But one thing I find that's really interesting that I've not really seen anywhere else in wrestling is these shoot interviews. So for anyone who doesn't know what that is, you can go on YouTube and you can find like hundreds of these interviews with professional wrestlers who basically, to shoot in the wrestling industry is when you tell the truth, when you like you actually tell behind the scenes stuff, or you kind of reveal things maybe that you shouldn't, and in the context of on a wrestling show, they would often do this in order to kind of lure you in with the story, because all the fans know that it's a work, it's not real, etc., right? But with these stories, the whole point was to kind of lure you in, where maybe 2/3 of the story you're being told is to be true, but then that third element is the lie, the work. And it's like, oh, I know this is true and I know this is true, but hang on, they're telling me this. Oh, I don't. And that's how they lure you in and bring you in to invested in the story.
Mick Foley was good at that.
One of the absolute best. Yeah.
When he broke away from just being Mankind, and they started introducing him as Mrs. Foley's baby boy. He literally would be like, let me talk about all these things I've done in my career that none of these other guys would do, that has made me the person I am, that shows you how dangerous I am, all these things that I've done. I started at this age and I did this. And Mick Foley would deliver his stories in that way, doing callbacks to things that he did, and then he'd bring it forward, and then he'd start getting a higher pitch, and he'd start getting more excited. And, he kind of, the anger in him you'd seem like the anger was rising, and his pitch would get higher, and, the things that he would say would just get more and more violent. And you're like, oh wow, he's crazy. And he's actually a very caring individual and a loving father. And
oh yeah, yeah. What you were saying before about how wrestlers and like how they are in real life are two different things. I mean, with some wrestlers, they live the gimmick. Like Hulk Hogan is just Hulk Hogan. Ric Flair is just Ric Flair. Like that's the real person.
Whoa. Let's talk about. Well, no, Ric Flair is just Ric Flair. 100%. But I've actually met Ric Flair 4 times.
Damn. I envy
and. What is amazing is that the last time that I met him, he remembered me.
Oh, amazing!
And I'm cool. Just like I've met him, and it had been several years. Flair frequented Myrtle Beach, where I grew up, so I had seen him at the Garden City Pier before. I had seen him at another appearance. I had actually gone to a WCW show. And met him and several other wrestlers. And then I went to a hockey game in Charleston, and it was Ric Flair night. And the person I was with wanted to go get their photo with Ric Flair. And I walk up and he's like, "John, how you doing?" And I was just like,
"Wow, oh, that's lovely."
And it was a date night. And, the photographer wanted to put Flair in the middle, and he's like, "No, I'm not doing that to my guy. I will stand over here with my guy. We're all going to huddle together. I'm not going to I'm not going to do that to him. We're going to do the photo like this." And, he's just he's always Flair, but he's not always Flair. Right. If you know what I'm saying, like Hulk Hogan is always Hulk Hogan.
When I say like Flair is always Flair, what I mean is obviously like he's not like bad guy trying to screw you over Flair. I mean more like the party goer gimmick, like that is legitimately him as a human being. There's more.
Well, he definitely is a party guy, but he also does have a laid back side to him. He's not the kiss stealing, wheeling and dealing.
Right. Yeah.
He is the limousine riding, jet flying, good time having, and very friendly, very genuine individual. And he's very humbled by the love that he gets from his fans. He really does. He's come up from the bottom. He's become one of the biggest names in an industry. Everybody knows who Ric Flair is. Everybody knows the woo. Everybody knows the 4 horsemen. When you hold up the 4, they know what that means. He's become an iconic symbol, even to people that don't know wrestling. They know Flair.
Absolutely.
And sometimes he's used as the oh, look at this guy. Obviously, he's the reason wrestling is back. He's even used as, the derogatory for, look at how horrible this is. Look at him. He hit the guy. He low blowed the guy. He did this. He did that. I'm
That's the
like,
best stuff about wrestling. What?
that's Ric Flair for you. Dirtiest player in the game.
That's the best
But
thing ever. Yeah.
it is. He's also a very humbled individual by it.
Sure.
And so, I was really meeting him was probably a great experience for me, because I got to see that, you know, these people that you see on the television, that you see in these things, even when you see them in the promos, um, there's a different side to them that you never get to see unless you meet them in person.
A modern wrestling example, which I thought was really good to this point, was are you familiar with Eddie Kingston, the AEW wrestler?
Um, Kingston.
He was
I think
in
so.
he was in NWA for a bit, and then he's been on AEW television. It's difficult to explain his gimmick. He's kind of a brawler. Um, I think he's from New York, so he's got that kind of like the Brooklyn kind of vibe. Or sorry, I can't remember where he's from. But that's kind of
I
his
don't.
setup. He's like a brawler, kind of deal. But I remember one time he was talking about his character, and he
Mhm.
said his character is essentially what he was like when he was, say, like 18, 19 years old, amped up to like the nth degree, like that's not him
Mhm.
as a human being now, but and to the point, took inspiration from his life, took something that was real and turned it into something. And I feel like
Yes.
a lot of these wrestlers tend to do that. Like sometimes they just create a character out of nothing, like Sting did with the Crow, which was obviously, as we know, was based on the Crow, but also other elements, and he put it together, right? But then
Yes.
you get these wrestlers who will take elements from their real life and try to blend it with fiction or amp it up in some way, and then that's what creates the character. I always find that interesting, particularly when they take elements from their real life, because it's blurring the lines a little bit. It's like, where does the character end and then the human start, and vice versa? Because sometimes you learn about a completely different person. Like, for example, Bray Wyatt, who we lost recently, is a good example of
Mhm.
this, because when he passed away, we were hearing all these stories about the man Wyndham Rotunda and what he was like, and it's like night and day. It's like obviously, because like the Fiend and Bray Wyatt was a character, but
Mhm.
I think the only real, and I'm just theorizing here, but like the only element of Wyndham that was in that character was his mind for storytelling and his creative um, mind, and that was all him. But then the character is a character kind of thing.
Yeah. So he's a great example of a good storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and a great example of, you know, the difference between the character that you see and the real person. Another good one is Andre the Giant. You know,
Interesting.
he
Okay.
was okay. So everybody saw Andre the Giant. He's Andre the Giant. Oh, I'm big
Yeah.
dog. And he was always the bad guy. He was supposed to be this unstoppable bad guy. He didn't really do a lot of promos. Um, have you ever heard of the movie The Princess Bride?
I have heard of it. Yeah. I've not seen it, but I've seen
Okay.
clips. I've seen his part in it and everything.
So the cast of The Princess Bride spent a lot of time working with Andre the Giant, this big man and granted, wrestlers too have talked about him. Andre as a person was a very peaceful, kind, non-violent soul. He was, you know, Andre as a wrestler was just big, hulking guy. He slapped that hand on you, he started with the freaking big hand moves. Um, he was just this monster you'd be terrified of. But as a person, as just an ordinary guy you'd meet out on the street, he was just a lovable giant. He was huge. Billy Crystal said it right when he looked at him and went, "You are the Brute Squad." He was the Brute Squad, but you know, he didn't want to be. He wanted to
Sure.
be everybody's friend. He wanted to be nice to everybody. He wanted to, be kind and generous and caring, and he was up until his untimely passing in the 90s. And a lot of wrestlers who worked with him remember him fondly, and a lot of wrestlers looked up to him because he was able to deliver the big man, um, who put on the big man, who was so terrifying, but still be himself outside of the ring. And I think he inspired a lot of the big man wrestlers that we've seen in the past. Um, and I'm not up on the current wrestling. I've kind of been out of it for a few years.
I get it. I get
Um,
it.
my favorites have all gone to pasture. They don't even get in the ring anymore. So it's kind of like it's a new. I'll look at it every once in a while and be like, oh, I remember the days when you know The Rock would come out and say, "It doesn't matter what your name is," or Stone Cold would say, "That's the bottom line," and I'd get all excited. NWO would come out. I remember those days. What in the world are they doing now? What is it? Who is this? I don't know who this
It's
is.
modern wrestling is very hit and miss. There is still excellent storytelling and wrestling going on, but where it used to be, you know, pretty much the whole card, now it's like small segments or certain feuds, certain matches. Like wrestling is still alive and well, but it's just not. It's just not the Attitude Era anymore. It's not the Golden Era anymore. Like the things are different, and obviously things change.
Yes.
I think the problem with modern wrestling. I mean, I could go on all day about this. I did an episode recently that people should check out on wrestling. The biggest problem is that there's too much focus on the in-ring product and not enough focus on the tangible story being told. Now, to be clear, you can tell a story in the ring. You can absolutely
Mm-hmm.
do that. You can have two guys or two girls get in the ring, have a fight, and you can tell a story as you go along. But they don't even do that. There's a
Hell
lot
in the
of
Cell between Mankind and Undertaker told the story.
there you go. Um, and there was a story going into that as well. So
Mm-hmm. A
I
very
look at
long
it
one.
right. I always look at it as like investment. The story pulls you in, and then the match is like the conclusion or the continuation of the story. And a story obviously has a beginning, middle, and end, and there you go. But that's what always draws you in. The stakes at hand. All the different things that happen along the way. If, for example, very basic story, but if it's a person chasing the championship, then it's,
Mm-hmm.
what are the struggles that they had to go through to get there? A good modern example right now, which is being told over a long-term period, is Cody Rhodes trying to become the WWE champion, and he's already lost against Roman Reigns, the big guy, the main guy, right? We've already
Yeah.
seen that loss, and a lot of people walked out and that going, oh, it's over then. The story's over. It's not going to happen.
No,
And
he's got to have the comeback.
exactly, this is what Triple H said at the end of WrestleMania in the press conference, I believe, or sometime afterwards. He said the story continues, and that was and just recently on the past SmackDown, they had like a bit of an altercation, like a bit of a stare down, and it's like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
and already that's brought people in. They're like excited because this is the first time they've been face to face for a long time. And that's, oh, and it's reignited a fire in there because it's part of a longer story arc.
And so I'm going to get away from wrestling a little bit.
Yeah, please do. Yeah. I just use it as an
Um,
example, but
but wrestling and comic books
okay.
kind of
Yeah.
work in the same way if you look at it. And the comic books have had you had the golden age, then you had the silver age. And to a lot of people, the silver age comics are ridiculous. Then we got the bronze age, um, which was the 80s, dark and gritty. Then we hit the kind of, what do we call it? The dark times. And now we've got the modern age of the comics. Um, the Bronze Age, you had your um, Killing Joke, Dark Knight Returns, Dark Phoenix Saga, um, and then as it started transferring, as it started transitioning, you started getting into comic books that really started messing with you. We killed Superman. We broke Batman's back. Um, we got a new Spider-Man. You know, we did things. Captain America died. We did things that, well, not we, but they did things in the comics and in these stories that were these long-running stories that affected major change. But they also changed the stories with the times. And a lot of people, they pick up a comic book and they go, "Oh, I don't like it anymore. It's not this." And it's like, you don't understand. Stories have to evolve. Your characters aren't always going to be the same because the story is going to evolve. If Batman was still the Batman he was in 1930s, running around using guns, um, you know, he wouldn't be the character that he is today. If he was the Batman from the 1960s, you know, the Batman from the 1960s was a duly deputized officer of the law.
Yeah.
He had a badge. He worked with the police. He wasn't a vigilante. He was a cop. He was a cop in a costume. That's who the Batman was.
Oh. Outrageous accusations. No, just kidding.
It's the truth.
It's true.
It's the truth. Adam West's Batman was a cop in a costume. But Adam West was a great Batman. Adam West was probably, if you were to rate them all on their delivery of the character, Adam West may be the best Batman. Now, is he the best overall? No. That argument can be given to Keaton. You can say that it was Bale. You can say that it was Affleck.
Batfleck.
Honestly, it was Kevin Conroy. For anybody who doesn't know, Kevin Conroy voiced him in Batman the Animated Series, and he's gone now. But Kevin Conroy is the best Batman, period. But, that character changed and evolved. And it wasn't the same character that Adam West played when Michael Keaton put on the Batsuit, when Kevin Conroy voiced him. The Joker wasn't the same character in Cesar Romero's time that he was when Jack Nicholson played him, or when Mark Hamill voiced him, or when Heath Ledger delivered his performance. Yeah, that's all I want to say about the Joker. In the comic books, these deliveries of these characters as they evolve over time, it's storytelling changing with the times. And when you're telling a story, sometimes you have to change your approach. So the story is always going to change. So I can tell you a story, and then you go deliver that story to somebody else, and your delivery is going to be different than mine. Your story is going to change. You might find, parts of the story that you think deserve more attention than I do. You might decide the character needs to shift a little bit because it is a story. And going back to this, my first episode is on Lavinia Fisher. Now, Lavinia Fisher in Charleston is rumored to be America's first female serial killer.
Wow.
Yes, okay. Her first female serial killer. Lavinia Fisher was executed. She executed herself, really, because on the gallows, she looked at people and said, "If you have any messages for the devil, give them to me now, for I shall see him directly." And then she walked off the gallows. She didn't let them hang her. She hung herself. And the legend is that she planned all these murders and she did this and she did that. But the truth of the matter is Lavinia Fisher wasn't executed for murder. She was executed for highway robbery because she was accused of being part of a gang that were highwaymen that were robbing merchants coming into Charleston in the early 1800s, just before the War of 1812. She was accused of killing these men. Or she wasn't accused of killing these men. She was accused of robbing them. There was never any murders tied to her. But there were so many unsolved murders and so many bodies found that 12 years after her death, a writer came in and changed the story. He told his version of the story. And his version of the story, Lavinia Fisher, who was a very meek woman who, you know, obedient to her husband, very pretty, but not really dolled up, became this very strong willed woman who dressed to the nines, who planned out these murders so meticulously that in some versions of the story, she had a mechanical device so that when she pulled a lever, the bed that her victims were sleeping on would drop out from underneath them and they would fall into a pit of spikes and die.
Oh my gosh.
And then they would dispose of the bodies, and she would take all the ill-gotten gain. And she was just this murderous woman, and supposedly she strolled through the streets in her pristine white dress with her head up high. And when they paraded these people through the streets, it was so that the townsfolk could kind of ridicule them and yell at them, but no one dare spoke when Lavinia walked because they were all afraid of her. Well, in reality, she rode a carriage from the courthouse to the gallows. She was protected the entire way, so nobody could. She was very meek. She was dressed probably in a very torn and worn dress. And up until she realized that no one was going to save her, she still thought that, it was when she hit the gallows that she flipped and started cussing and yelling and screaming and fighting because she realized no one was going to save her. She honestly thought that this can't happen to me. Nobody's going to hang me. My husband's going to stop it. Well, her husband was already hung and dead because he was one of the highwaymen. He accosted someone and they got caught. So it's really interesting how there's a bunch of dead bodies. So Lavinia Fisher is the serial killer in the story. But in reality, no one knows where the dead bodies are. No one knows who killed the dead bodies. Lavinia Fisher was executed for being associated with a gang of highwaymen who were responsible for several robberies, several murders that are unsolved, and were all executed together. She was executed with the gang because her husband was the leader of the gang. She may have never had any involvement whatsoever, but she died by association. But in the legend, she's this vicious, murderous person. And that's how stories evolve sometimes. And that's also one of the things I like to do with my show is I like to go, okay, here's this legend. It's a great legend. Oh, by the way, here's the real story. Just so you don't go around thinking I'm besmirching this person's good name. Look, here's what really freaking happened, okay? Just calm down. She's not really out there walking around in a white dress. She might be walking around in something else, but it's not her, okay?
There you go. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. I think it speaks volumes about, as you said, like this idea of like how will you tell a story?
Yeah.
Like it's that, and also just the fact that it's a bit like Chinese whispers. Really, a story gets told a million times, and it evolves and changes to something where sometimes it's so far removed from what the story actually is that it's not even. It's just a work of fiction at this point, if it's based on a true story. I mean,
yeah, but also, we get our legends, we get a lot of our history. All of it comes from storytelling. And in 150, 200 years, will they think that a man from space actually leaped the Empire State Building and stopped the locomotive? Will they think that some guy dressed up as a bat to fight crime in a drug-addled city, in 300-400 years, are they going to think that? No, but they might still be telling the stories. They might know that, it's not real, but those stories will still be there. We tell stories today of, the gods of Olympus. Zeus and his thunderbolt. We tell stories of Beowulf, fighting the Grendel. You know, sure, maybe something along those lines happened, but it probably isn't as grand as the story that we make of it. But the story is what spreads the legend, and it's what keeps the history alive because there are aspects in the story that have a deeper meaning. Um, you know, and that's the beauty of storytelling. And that's one of the reasons why I do it is because I'm keeping the stories alive.
And you got some brilliant stories. I want to kind of pick your brain on that and try a few different avenues on this perspective. Scariest paranormal story you've either experienced or been told.
So there is an episode called The Graveyard on my podcast, and it is something that actually happened to me. Um, the long and short of it is my friends and I went into a graveyard one night, and we were challenged to walk around the graveyard. Um, I ended up being the only one to actually complete the walk. Everybody else kind of jumped the fence and ran. Um, but as I was walking, someone came up behind me and was kind of coming towards me. And I couldn't really see who they were, but I like screamed at them and kept on walking. And I thought it was my friends. They all tell me that it's not them. I'm mad because I think they're lying to me. And so I go back towards the graveyard because I'm going to go back in there and prove to them that it was them. And we were across the street sitting in front of one church, and the graveyard was on the other side of the street. And I walked across the street and I put one foot on the sidewalk. And they were all trying to stop me. They were like, no, don't go in there, don't go in there. And just the scream erupted. And it sounded like it came from the graveyard. I don't know where it came from. Um, but they all ran. And I took a couple of seconds to evaluate my position, my life, the things that were going on. I was 12 at the time.
Oh my God.
And then I ran too.
Yeah.
And I booked it. And even though I was typically the slowest, I beat all of them back to the house, up the stairs, and into the room because I wasn't staying around to find out by myself what was going on. And to this day, I still don't know what actually happened. I know what I heard, I know what we all experienced, and I know that we all got so scared that we ran a block and a half back to my best friend's house to hide from it for the rest of the night. Um, so that I would say would probably be the scariest experience I've ever really had. Um, I think the scariest tale that I've ever told may be Lavinia.
Yeah.
I think she may be the scariest one. A lot of the thing with a lot of ghost stories is they're not always scary.
Sure. Yeah. I
Um,
suppose sometimes they just leave you with just endless questions, which is
yeah.
kind of a
Um,
good thing and a bad thing, depending on your outlook.
well, there are occasionally ghosts are you're more sad when you hear about the ghosts. You're like, oh,
Mm.
really? Like they've been doing this for 200 years? Like, really, man, that sucks. Wow. You know, there's not a lot of the ghost is going to rip your face off stories, really. The more deeper stories um, is this person went through these horrible things, or this trying time that this person had. They lost their life, and now they're stuck here.
I
They're just
remember
reliving it constantly.
I remember when I was living in Europe, there was someone I knew who allegedly could speak to the dead.
Hmm.
And she told me that in this particular place she lived, there was a guy who unfortunately had passed away from like a road accident, or he'd been run over, or something like that. And this guy would frequently come to her, the ghost, and would ask her, like, what's going on? Where am I? I don't understand. And she would keep saying and communicating with him and saying, there's nothing I can do. I don't know how can I really help you? I can't. There's nothing I can say or do. And but there was like, and this is what really fascinated me about this was this idea that the ghost would ask questions, but not. It wouldn't really take on board anything. It was just perpetually in a state of confusion. And like people often talk about when they hear about ghosts, either they see a ghost or experience it or even communicate with it. Often, what they talk about is this idea of an echo. So
Hmm.
it's not even like something you can interact with. It's more just like a flash in time. Maybe it's repeating something that happened, or maybe the ghost is trapped in a perpetual state. We hear about like trapped spirits and this idea that they just keep repeating, they keep, walking around the halls of whatever area they maybe even they died in, or maybe it's a familiar space, a home, something like that,
Hmm.
or even the ghosts that supposedly haunt places. People talk about this idea that the energy stays there, it's trapped there. Like bringing it back to wrestling as an example, I'm always fascinated with that the story of Bruiser Brody and how in those showers where Bruiser Brody was stabbed allegedly, because that's still left open, and I don't understand how. But yeah, well, anyway, I remember hearing Tammy Sitch tell a story thereafter about how her and Chris Candido had gone wrestling there in like the early 2000s, and they'd been told, "Oh, you have to go check out the showers. You have to go check it out. It's you got to go experience it for yourself." And she
Hmm.
said that like in Puerto Rico, apparently it's like always like really, really hot. Like there's no real air. It's this very sweaty kind of feeling wherever you go if you're wrestling in arenas there. So like everywhere's hot. But she said as soon as she walked into the shower, it was like deathly cold. And it had no business being cold. There was no air conditioning, there was no windows, there was no nothing. It was just suddenly really cold. And I often think about what I just outlined there before, this idea that maybe energy stays there in some shape or form.
And whatever happens, whatever that is, throw that into the story. When you put that into the story, the feeling that that gives,
Mm,
the thoughts that draws in, and then that's where these stories and these legends get us. Is um, it's not the necessarily the events that lead up to it. It is the tragic, you know, um, loss of time that this person has, that they're still, here. They're not able to move on. They're not able to get past it. They're stuck reliving this horrific event over and over and over and over again. You know, um, the media likes to grab hold of all these, the poltergeist, the scary things, but the really scary thought of a ghost story, um, is the idea that if something like that happened to you,
yeah.
you would be stuck for hundreds of years. There are ghost stories in England that have been told. What you guys have got ghost stories that are 700, 800 years old. Imagine thousands of years of standing around a castle, watching everything else going on, and not being able to do anything about it. And all of a sudden, you see some kid walking around with a Nintendo Switch, and you remember back in your day, all you had was a stick.
Well, another thing with that as well is like, let's suppose for a minute that ghosts were
Conscious of what's going on.
right, yeah.
Yes.
There would be no basis for connection. I mean, obviously, there's always going to be a basic connection between humans, regardless of time. But you know, you separate. If me and you were to go back in time 800 years, right, and try and interact with people. Well, firstly, we wouldn't understand what anyone's saying, and vice versa, because English language has changed. But
Mm-hmm.
more importantly, our basis for connection would be severed somewhat, or maybe not basis for connection, but like um,
We would be
what's
in
the
an alien world.
yeah, like the where we draw. How can I put this? Our basis for comparison, or
Hmm.
like being able to relate to one another, so on and so forth. We could only really relate to each other on the very most basic of things. I
Exactly.
remember one time someone said like, "Oh, if, for example, it were possible to talk to animals and like they could talk in English, we wouldn't be able to understand them anyway because their frames of reference, that's what I was trying to refer to. The frames of
Mhm.
reference would be so different that it just would not be something that you could even possibly even hope to comprehend."
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Um, to you know, there are things today that to someone in the Middle Ages would be considered magic,
Yeah.
demons, all kinds of, a car. Are you kidding me? A car, an automobile, something we're used to seeing every day. Billions of people drive around. They clog up the streets, they pollute the place. You drive one of those through 13th century England and watch how fast you got a whole army wanting to kill you. Drop one in the middle of Egypt, all of a sudden they're building you a pyramid. Um, you know, these things, and this is how everything evolves. And this is why it's important kind of to tell these stories. Because we have no, our connection to the past is merely in these stories. Once we go to a new age, that past is done. There's no going back. You can't go back to before there was a car. I mean, you can try, but the world's already found the car, and we already know what it is. If we go get on horses now, we're going to be like, man, cars were so much cooler. We can't go back to before there was flight. We already know we can fly across the ocean. We can't go back to before America was discovered. It's already been done. You can't, just go back and go, nope, America wasn't discovered. If you go that way, you're going to fall straight off. Some guy gets in a boat, goes that way. Oh, look, America discovered it again. No, you can't discover it again. It's already been discovered. It's populated. We can't undo the past, but we can tell stories and try to explain to not only each other, but to those coming behind us what the past was like, what they had to live through, and try and get into that mindset through the stories. You know, I can tell you all day that, uh, 18th century Americans didn't have running water and had to cook with fire. But I can't just give you the facts and make you feel the story. I could state facts all day long. Um, Facts aren't going to get you into what it was really like without the story.
Moving it forward, what's the most inspirational story you have or that you've ever been told?
That's a tough one. I don't have any real inspirational ones on my podcast, but there is a story about this. It is no, I don't like that one either. Uh, Probably the most inspirational story I would have to say would have to do with and I'm trying to remember it now because it has to do with an Olympian who came back and she was the gymnast, and I can't remember the story now, but it was back in the 90s, and she came back. And no, I'm not talking about the ice skater Nancy Kerrigan. That wasn't really inspirational. That was two chicks fighting. No, it was this gymnast, and she had like this really bad injury, and she came back, and I think she won the gold. And I was really touched back as a kid. Um, Other ones would be stories of people who survived events like 9/11. Like
Mm.
there were these two guys, they were inside of the buildings when they came down. They were two ports authority cops, and they were the last two brought out. They had the buildings down on top of them for, I think it was almost 72 hours.
Jesus.
Of people digging through rubble trying to find them. They were pretty much considered dead by that point, and they ended up finding and rescuing them. And I met them and another guy uh, on October 6th of 2001, NASCAR, back when it was the Winston Cup, honored firefighters. Little known fact, I was a firefighter for several years, and I was asked to participate in this event, and brought up to Lowe's Motor Speedway, free tickets, got to go on a race, and asked to, walk out and basically be thanked for what I did as my job by NASCAR and the NASCAR fans. But in that, I got to meet three of the guys that were in Ground Zero and meet these guys. And, you know, their survival enough is, inspirational. But hearing their story, talking to them, talking about the battles they had to do just to get back to being able to show up to an event like this, is that's majorly inspirational. Yeah, that was inspirational for me, particularly as a firefighter, because it felt like a big hit, and a big personal hit, considering how many of my brothers were lost in that event. But still, we came back and we kept fighting. And another good one is the city of Charleston after the events of the Sofer Superstore fire in 2008. In 2008, I'm sorry, 2007, 9 firefighters lost their lives in a commercial structure fire here in Charleston. The town obviously was devastated, but the fire department rebuilt, reorganized, restructured, came back, and has become one of the best departments in the country simply because they could not let those men die in vain. They had to do something about it. Those are stories of inspiration. And it's hard to pick just one.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, and I think it kind of speaks to the idea that that often the greatest stories are just from everyday people like you and me that just living their lives, and they do something to help one another in a meaningful way, and it literally changes lives, saves lives even. So it's incredible.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk a little bit about your time as a firefighter. Let's start with, what would you say is the most memorable moment for you as a firefighter?
There was a accident in late one evening. I had worked a full shift and then responded out to a call afterwards, which was a structure fire. And I was leaving the structure fire on the way home. I was planning to go home, get some dinner, and go to sleep. It was 10, 11 o'clock at night. And we're coming home. And on the way back from where the structure fire was, a intoxicated driver ran into a family of motorists, or a family in a motor vehicle. And it was a mother and 5 children. And these children were from 6 months to 15. My patient was a 4-year-old little girl. She couldn't tell me she was 4 because she had a bad laceration to her hand, and she couldn't hold up one of her fingers. I bandaged her up, took care of her. I took care of that patient. I was an EMT. She was my patient. She sticks with me. That whole scene sticks with me. At first, we didn't know where the baby was. The car seat had actually been ejected from the vehicle, and the baby was just fine, just chilling. wasn't crying or anything, so that's why we didn't know where the baby was. Baby was just fine, just chilling, still in the car seat. What's going on? Where is everybody? I see all the flashing lights. She was dazzled by all the flashing lights. Um, I rode in the ambulance with my patient, the infant who was perfectly fine, and the oldest child, the 15-year-old son. And, you know, we went to the hospital. I met with the father. I told him where his wife and everybody was. The worst injury they had was some minor neck injuries that the mother suffered because the brunt of the impact was on the driver's side, of course. And I think the son had like an injured leg. I believe he had a fracture to the lower leg. Tib fib is what we call it. But other than that, fine. Everybody walked away with minor scrapes and bruises.
Oh, wow.
And of course, it was miraculous. Now, of course, the drunk guy, he walked away with nothing except for a nice trip to jail
Right.
for, nearly killing 5 people. But we had a guy that I used to work with. He was a paramedic, and he gets on scene. He's this big, tall, he's kind of skinny, but he's muscular. And he gets there and he sees that we're working on a kid, and he hears he was drunk, and he gets angry and turns to go after the drunk guy. And I'm like, oh no. And his wife happened to be on the scene, and she's like, Lindy, no, 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 you can't do that. Leave him alone. And I'm like, oh, this would have been interesting to watch. But fortunately, the drunk guy got dealt with by the police and not by the paramedic, who likely would have been much harsher than the law was. Um, but yeah, that one sticks with that one has always stuck with me. That was my first year. That was pre 2001. I was brand new. Maybe 6 months out of the academy when that one happened.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate it.
Oh no, no problem.
Just a follow-up question. What would you say is the biggest lesson or takeaway from your time as a firefighter?
Every life is precious. You know, lots of people, they don't value life like they should. You know, there are things that can happen in the blink of an eye that can change your life, and you can have no control over it. So you need to kind of not only value your life, but value the lives of those around you, of your loved ones, your friends, because you never know what is going to happen outside that door. You never know what's going to happen inside the door. You do not have control over the future. We cannot predict fate. We cannot plan these things out. And not everything is in your control. We like to imagine that it is, but it's not. So you need to take life at what it is, which is an extremely valuable and important thing, and cherish every one, um, even the lives of those you don't like. You need to understand that life it's a very finite thing, and once it's over, it's over. There's no coming back. We don't get a redo. We don't get a respawn. We're not coming back. This isn't a video game. Um, I have worked on patients that were 90 some odd years old, and I have worked on patients that were less than a year old. I've had saves where they were in their 70s. I saved them when they were 4 or 5. It's not a luck of the draw. It is literally just when it happens, it's gonna happen. You can't be prepared for it. You have to understand that if you're not treating it as valuable as it is, you're going to miss it when it's gone.
Thanks for sharing. A couple of final questions for you that I ask every guest.
Okay.
What's the biggest mistake you've made that you learned a valuable life lesson from?
Um, I never took care of myself. As I said, I used to be a firefighter.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason that I'm not, and it's because I suffer from PTSD.
I was thinking of asking you about that, but I didn't want to press. But yeah, please continue.
Yeah, I have CPTSD, um, and other issues because I didn't do the things that I needed to do to take care of myself when I needed to. If I could give anybody any piece of advice, it would be to take care of yourself. And again, that's why I said life is so precious. Um, because I can't. I've been through therapy. I'm going on 5 years of therapy now. I still can't do the things that I used to do. I can't. Um, I still have those, you know, issue warning alarms that won't let me go out and do what I used to do. I can't run into a burning building anymore. I can't ride on a fire truck anymore because the sirens, the sounds, the sirens, they all are triggers. These are things that I loved, things that I lived for at one point in time, and they've been taken away from me because I didn't take care of my mental health. So mental health is very important, and if you don't take care of it, it's going to become a problem.
Thanks for sharing.
No, no problem.
What's the best advice you've ever received?
The best advice I've ever received is that you don't fail until you quit. Um, the Chumbawamba's got a song. I get knocked down, I get back up again.
Yeah.
As long as you are getting back up again, you're not done. Fight's not over. You only fail if you give up. You know, yeah, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. But sometimes to win, you got to be a little insane. You know, we even mentioned it before. Cody Rhodes lost the fight, but it's not over unless Cody gives up going for that title, right? So failure only happens when you give up. You
Man,
lose on a failure. That's a lesson.
did I need to hear that right now? Thank you.
Hey, no problem.
What's the biggest life lesson you've learned so far?
Biggest life lesson that I've learned so far is that you don't need to be huge. You don't need to be the best to be successful. Success is what you measure. Um, it was actually one I learned recently. Um, if you take and think of what you think of as successful in your mind at first, and then you go, well, okay, this is this thing, what makes that successful? And then you compare it to, where you are. A lot of times you'll find out you are successful. You just have this imaginary thing in your head of what successful is. And because you're not there, you don't appreciate your own success. You don't have to be a movie star to be successful. You don't have to be the greatest cook to be successful. Take pride in the smaller successes. Be proud that you've got 5 years of podcasting and have an audience. Be proud that, you're talking to guys from, halfway around the world about firefighting and wrestling and storytelling. These are things that not everybody does. These are things that are experiences that, show that you're successful at what you do because you've got some guy from across the pond jumping on the freaking chat with you. Success is measured by you, not the and you don't have to measure it against anybody else. You know, if I had spent more time thinking about all the things that I did do right, you know, I became a firefighter, I became a fire instructor, I was a dispatcher, I was a medic, I'm a father, you know, I've written 2 books. You know, if I looked at all my successes, then my failures don't really mean anything. You know, sure, I wrote 2 books and I have 10 that I've just given up on because I didn't think they worked. You know, so what? I've got 2 that are out. I've succeeded twice. Um, you know, so what? I don't have 10,000 followers on TikTok. I've got 8,900. That's 8,900 successes. They liked something and started following me. And that's where you have to understand is that measure your success against you. If you have done something and won, that's success. And when you realize that, you'll be a lot happier.
I think it's interesting the way the universe works sometimes. This was definitely exactly what I needed to hear. And I know my listeners, people that follow me, will be thinking right now, see, told you. So, yeah, thank you so much, man. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Final question for you. Do you have
Mm-hmm.
any upcoming projects or final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
So we have pulled through the flames. Discontinued my partnership with Olympia Publishing, which is actually there in London. And it's going to be re-released here in the next couple of months with a new cover. Um, its follow-up will be coming out, and it's going to follow Through the Flames, of course, is about firefighting, and its follow-up is going to follow the main character Wayne's son as he goes through the fire academy. So both of those books will be coming out probably sometime in the next year. Of course, my second book, Redcoats, is still out. Redcoats is a horror novella that focuses on a group of British soldiers, of course, redcoats, coming back to take revenge on the city of Georgetown's teenagers after they're awakened some 200 years later in the 1990s. And yeah, it's a fun little horrific tale. Of course, you can catch my podcast at thecarolinastoryteller.com. We're wrapping up season 1 now. Season 2 will begin in January. I don't have an exact date yet, but you can catch all of the episodes for season 1. There's some bonus episodes this month because it's Halloween. We have Let Me Tell You the Movie, which is me and my son Adam going over horror movies. So far, we've done Child's Play and Friday the 13th. Who knows what the other 2 bonus episodes will be? I'm not giving them away, but they'll be showing up before the end of this month.
It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much for appearing on the show and sharing your stories and just kind of giving us an insight into storytelling and also your experiences and everything in between. Thank you so much.
Well, Christian, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And to your listeners, I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Absolutely. And to my listeners and followers, thank you so much, as always, for listening to the show or watching the show. I sincerely appreciate it. Please go out of your way to check out Jonathan's work. He's clearly very talented, as we've heard, and it's your opportunity to hear more and more stories. So there you go. Go check out his work. I'll make sure to leave links in the description. In addition, if you would like to support the show, I mentioned at the beginning, but if you'd like to support the show, you can do so by leaving us a review on Podchaser, or alternatively on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to the show. Please leave us a review. Please leave us your comments. Let us know what you think. It really, really helps the show out. In addition, check out the Discord. Become a member of our community, join the patreon.com/Christian Reeve, support the show and get access to bonus content. And most importantly, be safe, be well, and I'll see you in the next one.